The plane was buzzing with the usual hum of chatter, but what happened next would silence the entire cabin. A black woman was forcibly arrested by a police officer in front of stunned passengers. The tension was palpable, the air thick with confusion. What had she done to deserve this? As the officer's grip tightened, she looked up at him, calm yet unwavering, and uttered a single sentence. That one sentence stunned everyone, leaving the officer speechless and the passengers frozen. It was clear, something wasn't adding up. What did she say that made the officer regret his actions? Was there more to this story than meets the eye? Stick around, because what happens next will leave you questioning everything. What started as a routine flight quickly turned into an unforgettable encounter that none of the passengers would ever forget. A confident, successful black woman boarded the plane, eager for her journey, but she had no idea that her mere presence would set off a shocking chain of events. The pilot, who was trusted with the lives of everyone on board, refused to fly her for reasons that were impossible to ignore. His actions, clearly motivated by prejudice, stunned the entire cabin and left her in utter disbelief. As whispers began to spread, the atmosphere grew tense and emotions flared. But just when it seemed like this injustice might go unchecked, her husband stepped in. Calm and resolute, he was armed with more than just words. He ensured the pilot would face the consequences of his behavior. What happened next stunned everyone and changed the pilot's life in an instant. Keep watching to find out how this powerful moment unfolded. As the plane sat on the tarmac, the tension in the air was almost unbearable. The woman's face was a mixture of shock and confusion, trying to understand how this could be happening. She had flown countless times before, always respectful and calm, and yet here she was, singled out for no clear reason. The pilot, standing at the front of the cabin, refused to make eye contact with her. It was as though he had already decided, before even speaking to her, that she didn't belong. His actions didn't just affect her, they affected everyone around her. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, some nervously glancing at the crew, others muttering quietly, unsure of what to do. But then her husband spoke up. He was a quiet man, known for his level-headed nature. Yet today, his calm demeanor hid an intense sense of justice. He stood up, walked toward the flight attendant, and asked what was going on. His voice was steady, but there was an undeniable weight in his words. He wasn't just asking for an explanation, he was demanding accountability. The flight attendants, caught in the middle, seemed uncomfortable, unable to do anything beyond offering empty reassurances. The pilot's voice suddenly crackled over the intercom. "We are unable to proceed with the flight due to an unresolved issue with one of the passengers. We ask for your understanding." But the words only made the situation worse. The passengers were starting to grow restless, their unease turning into murmurs of dissent. The husband's patience was wearing thin. He stepped forward again, his voice rising slightly as he turned to the cabin crew. "This is not about understanding. This is about right and wrong." The room went silent, and a collective gasp escaped from the passengers. What was happening now? Had the airline made the call to remove them both? The husband stood up slowly, his expression calm, but his jaw clenched tight. He was prepared for this, but the tension in the cabin surged to an almost unbearable level. Was this going to escalate into a physical confrontation? As the officer stepped closer, the woman's heart began to race. Her hands gripped the armrests, her mind spinning. She hadn't expected this. It was like a second layer of the plot had been revealed, something darker, more calculated. What had the airline been planning all along? Was this some sort of cover-up to protect the pilot, to bury whatever wrongdoing had taken place? Her husband, looking unshaken, glanced back at her, and for the briefest moment she saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, but it vanished quickly. He turned toward the officer, his voice low but steady. "We're not going anywhere," he said. "You're going to have to force us off this plane." The officer hesitated for a split second, but only long enough to raise more questions than answers. What was this sudden push to get them off? Was it just about the pilot, Or was there something more beneath the surface, something even the passengers didn't know yet? Before anyone could process the implications, another flight attendant rushed forward, whispering something in the officer's ear. The officer's face twitched, and for the first time, a flicker of doubt appeared in his eyes. The passengers couldn't help but exchange nervous glances. The situation was spiraling, and no one could predict where it would lead. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, an unexpected voice cut through the silence. "It's a mistake," the voice said from the back of the plane. The whole thing was a setup. Every head in the cabin turned. The woman's eyes widened in disbelief. Who could possibly have said that? And why? Her mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle as everything she thought she knew about this situation was suddenly being called into question. Could this really be what it seemed? Or was there yet another twist, another secret waiting to be uncovered? The officer's mouth opened in shock, but no words came out. The passengers stared, stunned, as the weight of the moment hit them all at once. Justice, however delayed, had arrived. But just as the room began to settle, and the passengers let out collective sighs of relief, the final twist hit. The woman's husband, still standing beside her, suddenly turned to the man who had revealed everything. "You're not just a passenger, are you?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. The man smiled, but it wasn't a smile of relief. It was a knowing, almost calculating smile. "Let's just say, I have some connections you don't know about." The entire cabin went silent again. Who was this man? And what role had he played in everything that had just unfolded? The woman, her mind racing, now realized that the story was far from over. This moment, though a victory, had opened the door to a much bigger revelation, and no one knew where it would lead next. Inside the coffee shop, the energy quickly shifted back to normal, as if the chaotic scene had never happened. The barista, still processing the unexpected confrontation, took a deep breath and returned to the counter with a renewed sense of calm. Just as they started to prepare the next cup of coffee, a few familiar faces approached the counter. They were regulars, customers who came in every morning, chatting about everything from work to the weather. Today, though, they had a different purpose. One of them placed a large tip jar on the counter, a stack of cash already inside. "For dealing with that," he said with a grin, referring to the earlier scene with Karen. The others nodded in agreement, and one by one, they contributed their own tips. The barista blinked in surprise, but their face lit up with gratitude. A cheer spread through the small crowd of customers who had witnessed the exchange, all feeling a little better knowing that Karen's outburst had been met with such support and kindness from the community. The pilot, still standing at the front, looked increasingly uneasy, as if he could sense the growing unrest. The woman could see it in his face. He knew this wasn't going away. But would he finally admit his mistake? Would the airline intervene and fix this? Or would they allow it to escalate further, turning this moment into something much bigger? The sound of footsteps echoed down the aisle, and her husband returned. His expression was grim, but there was something in his eyes that told her everything had just changed. She took a deep breath, knowing that the final moment was approaching, and the fate of the situation would soon be revealed. Would the injustice of the pilot's actions finally be acknowledged, or would they all be forced to face the consequences of this moment? The tension in the cabin reached its peak, and no one knew which way it would tip. As the husband made his way back to his seat, the entire cabin seemed to lean in, waiting for his next move. He sat down next to his wife, his face unreadable, and the passengers collectively held their breath. Everyone thought they were on the brink of something monumental. But then, just when it seemed like the tension would finally break, the flight attendants suddenly moved with urgency. The cabin lights flickered briefly, and an unsettling hush fell over the passengers. Without warning, a second officer appeared from the back of the plane. This one wasn't in uniform like the pilot, but his demeanor was just as imposing. He moved with purpose down the aisle, and there was an air of authority about him that sent a chill down everyone's spine. He stopped at the woman's row, and his eyes locked onto her husband. "Sir, "We need you to step off the plane immediately," the officer said, his voice cold and firm. The room went silent, and a collective gasp escaped from the passengers. What was happening now? Had the airline made the call to remove them both? The husband stood up slowly, his expression calm, but his jaw clenched tight. He was prepared for this, but the tension in the cabin surged to an almost unbearable level. Was this going to escalate into a physical confrontation? As the officer stepped closer, the woman's heart began to race. Her hands gripped the armrests, her mind spinning. She hadn't expected this. It was like a second layer of the plot had been revealed, something darker, more calculated. What had the airline been planning all along? Was this some sort of cover-up to protect the pilot, to bury whatever wrongdoing had taken place? Her husband, looking unshaken, glanced back at her, and for the briefest moment she saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, but it vanished quickly. He turned toward the officer, his voice low but steady. "We're not going anywhere," he said. "You're going to have to force us off this plane." The officer hesitated for a split second, but only long enough to raise more questions than answers. What was this sudden push to get them off? Was it just about the pilot, or was there something more beneath the surface, something even the passengers didn't know yet? Before anyone could process the implications, another flight attendant rushed forward, whispering something in the officer's ear. The officer's face twitched, and for the first time, a flicker of doubt appeared in his eyes. The passengers couldn't help but exchange nervous glances. The situation was spiraling, and no one could predict where it would lead. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, an unexpected voice cut through the silence. "It's a mistake," the voice said from the back of the plane. The whole thing was a setup. Every head in the cabin turned. The woman's eyes widened in disbelief. Who could possibly have said that? And why? Her mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle as everything she thought she knew about this situation was suddenly being called into question. Could this really be what it seemed? Or was there yet another twist, another secret waiting to be uncovered? What came next shocked everyone. The husband didn't just challenge the pilot. He challenged the system. He demanded to speak to the airline's higher-ups, threatening to take legal action if this was not resolved immediately. His resolve was unshakable, and it sparked something in the other passengers. Whispers of support spread, and a few voices joined his, calling for justice. The flight attendants, overwhelmed and unsure, tried to calm the crowd, but the simmering anger was undeniable. Meanwhile, the woman sat quietly, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. She hadn't asked for this fight, but now, with her husband's determination, it was clear she wasn't facing this alone. She had no idea how far this would go, but one thing was certain: the pilot's actions would not be ignored. But as the tension grew, so did the uncertainty. Would the airline back down? Would the pilot's prejudiced behavior go unpunished? Or would this moment become something that would force real change? As the minutes ticked by, the feeling of anticipation was overwhelming. The passengers waited, unsure of what the next step would be, but everyone knew one thing for sure: this wasn't just about a delayed flight. It was about standing up against something far bigger, and nobody was backing down. The minutes felt like hours as the tension on the plane reached a boiling point. The flight attendants, now clearly uncomfortable, stood at the back of the cabin, whispering among themselves. The husband's resolve was unshakable, but the longer this dragged on, the more the other passengers began to stir. There were those who quietly supported him, nodding in agreement, but others were growing impatient, wondering why the flight wasn't moving forward. Yet, through it all, the woman remained eerily calm, her eyes fixed on the pilot. Her husband was relentless, demanding answers, but the airline had yet to respond. The flight crew remained tight-lipped, trying to deflect his questions, but the passengers were no longer willing to stay quiet. More voices joined in, questioning the pilot's actions, asking why she had been singled out. The discomfort in the cabin was palpable. It was as if the walls were closing in. And then, just when the situation seemed like it was about to spiral completely out of control, the sound of a phone buzzing cut through the noise. Her husband's phone. He glanced down at the screen, his expression unreadable, before he turned back to the front of the cabin. Without saying a word, he walked toward the cockpit, and a sense of dread washed over the room. Everyone knew this was the moment that would determine everything. As he reached the cockpit door, the passengers watched, some holding their breath, others barely able to keep their eyes open. What would happen next? Would the airline finally step in, or would this situation escalate beyond repair? The minutes felt like an eternity as the husband stood there, speaking with someone on the other side of the door. He gestured back toward the cabin, his voice low but clear. The passengers could see the look of determination in his eyes, but they couldn't hear the conversation. And then, silence. The woman shifted in her seat, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know how much longer this standoff could go on. It felt as if the entire plane was holding its breath, waiting for something to give. She glanced around at the passengers, most of whom had been quietly watching the scene unfold, unsure of how to help. But now their eyes were filled with something else: anticipation.